Hey everybody, um, welcome to my first video lecture. I have not done this before, so I'm coming to you from my living room in Twig, Minnesota. I hope that you all are staying safe wherever you are. I hope that you are not going out if you don't have to. Wash your hands a lot of times, whatever you can do to keep yourself safe. This semester is ending up being a lot weirder than I thought it would be. So we're probably going to have to change and amend things as we learn more. For now, I'm trying to stick to the syllabus as much as I can, but that may change. I posted an update. I hope you all read that. The update will tell you more about some changes to the assignments. I think for discussions, I'm going to change that as well to be more focused on these conversations that we have via video chat. And then I'll give you prompts and things to respond to in the video. Today I'm going to be talking about gender socialization. I have a PowerPoint that goes along with this chat that will be posted in Canvas along with the video, so check that out. Can't think of any other housekeeping things right now. If you are in extenuating or extreme circumstances, something truly remarkable, let me know. We can coordinate together to figure out how we can finish out the semester. It's doubtful we're going to make it all the way to mid-May, so I may post sort of a final exam due date before then, and then just call that a day. So far I've updated your exam grades in Canvas, and I've updated the first paper grades in Canvas, so that should all be done. That should give you a good sense of where you're at grade-wise. I also posted attendance for the parts of the month that we actually did meet in person, so the attendance grades are complete and up to date. We won't be meeting again in person, it sounds like, so don't worry about any additional attendance points. I will issue you points for our discussion boards that will sort of fill in the gap for that. But TBD on what those discussions will be about. It's not going to be as involved as the ones I've had earlier because I want this to be a little bit more fun. But do keep up with your reading because a lot of what we talk about is going to be based on the reading. Okay, so I'm going to jump into the presentation. I haven't yet figured out how to share my screen so that you can see the PowerPoint while I'm talking. So you get to look at me while I'm talking. I'd recommend playing this video while you have the PowerPoint open, and I'll kind of go along the way. Feel free to pause and take lots of breaks. I don't want you to have to sit and listen to a video for a whole hour, although I don't know that I'll go that long. Because I'm at home and I have a toddler as well as a spouse, there might be some distractions in the background that come up, so just bear with me through that. Grab your cup of coffee and let's get started together. Okay, so socialization. One great way to start learning about socialization is actually to take the implicit association tests that are offered by Harvard University. These tests have been around since the 90s, published since the early 2000s. Millions of people have taken these implicit association tests to find out about biases that we may be holding without even realizing it. So one of the most powerful things about that is, of course, you know that I hold a lot of feminist viewpoints, and I like to think that I don't look at the world in terms of gender bias, or that I don't hold a lot of gender bias. But when I took the implicit association test, I found that just like most other people who grew up in this culture, I hold some of the same gender biases. One thing to know about these implicit association tests is that they can test bias for gender, race, class, ethnicity, and all sorts of things. And they change the tests out pretty often. I think there's 14 of them available now. If you took my class last semester, you've already done this assignment. You did the race implicit association test, which is one of the oldest and most interesting ones, I think. One thing to know is that even Black respondents tend to show a preference for white people when they take these implicit association tests. So you might find, if you're white, that you also have a preference for white people, even though you didn't think that you did, because these are our split-second judgments that we make before we even consciously realize the decision that we're making. And a lot of times those things can be pretty inconsequential, right? Maybe you have an instant bias, but you have a chance to think about it and then you change the way that you act. And that's fine. A lot of us work on that throughout our lives, right? To be less biased in situations or to hold less prejudice. But it matters in split-second decisions when you're doing something like police work, for example. If you have to make a decision on whether or not someone is a threat, you have to do that instantly. And if you hold internal bias that you don't even realize, that can be incredibly dangerous. And it might help us to explain why so many people of color, particularly Black men, are injured or killed by police officers, because they have to make those split-second decisions and may even unintentionally hold bias. It might also help us explain why even Black police officers tend to make those split-second decisions and favor white suspects as opposed to Black suspects. So again, these are all things that are being studied by sociologists, and it's very interesting work. Another interesting note you'll see from the presentation is that gay respondents tend to also prefer straight people. Straight people tend to prefer straight people, just in that instant bias. So you might, again, not think that you hold that bias, but it can be there. So for example, like I said, I took the gender career one many, many, many times, and even I, knowing full well that I know better, tend to prefer men in certain professions. So it's a pretty interesting test. I really recommend you take it. It's not mandatory. They're quick though. They don't take very long, and it can help you understand some of your internal biases. So check that out if you have time. It's a fun way to spend a little bit of your self-quarantine time. So let's move on to the next slide, where we're going to talk about nature versus nurture. So you may have heard this before, particularly if you've taken any psychology or sociology classes before. It's a hotly debated topic. Maybe you've never taken those classes, but you've even heard this in common culture. We talk a lot about nature versus nurture. There's arguments to be made for both sides. The nature argument says that human behavior is natural, that we are just born a certain way, and that's how we will be throughout our lives, that biology, genetics, and other things determine how our lives are going to go. They believe that behavior is linked to biology, and therefore it's unchangeable. So people are just born that way, like I said. An example of that might be belief that, if someone's a criminal, they were just born to be a criminal, or something like that. One of the problems with this viewpoint is that it really strips people of their agency. As we know, people are complicated and have many intersections of identity that may come into play when looking at behavior. So a lot of folks believe that there's some combination of both nature and nurture. The nature argument has been used to justify some pretty horrific behavior, things like colonialism and social hierarchy. Some people are just born to be slaves would be an example from the slavery days in America and other countries. We know now that that's wrong, and I think most people don't hold that viewpoint anymore. But that was a justification that was used to explain away the moral inconsistency of slavery. So we have to be really careful about nature arguments, because they don't allow much of freedom of choice on our part as humans, and we know that we do have some freedom. So the nurture argument kind of goes to the extreme opposite of that, and said that human behavior is not determined by biology or by genetics, and that behavior can be learned and unlearned. So if you learn how to, or if you're socialized to believe things or to behave in a certain way, that behavior can be changed through intentional behavior modification on your own part, or through our institutions that we learn things from. And we'll talk about that more later. The good thing about the nurture argument, I think, that is attractive to people, is that it allows us to view society and individuals as constantly changing, as agents who have the ability to change. And it challenges hierarchy, because human behaviors are not natural, but they're defined by us. That means that if we have a social order that ranks people by caste or class, that's just something that we as humans created, and we are just as capable of uncreating. And that is an important argument in sociology, and something we're going to be talking about a great deal as we talk about gender. So on the next slide, I talk a little bit about social isolation. So one of the ways that we know that humans are socialized to behave in certain ways, rather than just being born that way, is that when we study humans who have extreme social isolation, their behavior is extremely different than people who have been socialized, regardless of genetics. So unfortunately, these kind of studies of human isolation are not ethical. We can't really treat human beings that way in a scientific study because it would damage a human too much to do so. So that means their studies are limited to animals and humans who have been in extremely traumatic environments through, not through scientific study, but through life circumstances. So there's been quite a few peer-reviewed studies on monkeys where we see that social isolation causes them severe developmental and mental health problems. One of the most famous studies of this is monkeys who were separated from their mother at birth and were given either no maternal figure or a wire mother, so like basically a hanger shaped to look like a monkey, and then a similar hanger shaped to look like a monkey that had fur and cloth on it. And the monkeys who had no mother at all fared far worse than even ones who had the wire-shaped mother, who did a little bit better. But overall, all of the monkeys who didn't have an actual mother figure did very badly. They weren't socialized, they had behavioral and mental problems as a result of not having access to the one of the most powerful socializers, which is parents. So again, human cases have not been able to be repeated because of the ethical implications, but looking at people who were, for example, kidnapped and held without human contact, or children who've been severely isolated as child abuse cases, we can see that people in those kind of social isolation situations develop severe mental and developmental problems as a result. And in many cases, those can't be easily undone because childhood socialization is so powerful. But even in the most extreme cases, some human contact has been able to help those people recover. So, all of that being said, sociologists believe that nurture plays a much larger role than nature in human development. So, in sociology courses and in your study of sociology, you're going to find that belief that nature or that nurture plays a larger role than nature. And that's an assumption that we're going to make going forward, given that this is a sociology course. And also in gender studies, we seem to make that assumption quite often as well. Now, that isn't to say that biological factors play no role. They certainly do play a role, and as we really look at gender and sex, we're going to see that there is some biological basis for some of these things, but that our socialization plays a much bigger role. So that's a sneak preview of what's to come as we study gender. The overall takeaway here is that human beings need socialization and they need their society in order to grow, learn, and develop. Through socialization, we learn about acceptable behavior, norms, and values. And when we are socially isolated, we don't learn those things. So all of you in this class and myself have gone through some form of socialization throughout our lives. And an interesting thing is that because socialization varies so much by culture and region and nationality and race, there's a lot of variability in what we learn to be normal and acceptable behavior. So I'll show some examples later on, but when we talk about gender, but I think of something like hand holding. In American culture, if two men are holding hands, it's a pretty good signifier that they are gay or that they're in a romantic relationship. Men don't frequently hold hands with each other in American culture. So that's something that we've learned through socialization. Outside of childhood, men tend not to touch each other very much. Now, in other cultures, particularly in the Middle East, where there's a lot of homosocial bonds, which is not sexual but social, men tend to hold hands a lot as a signifier of respect and as a signifier of their friendship. So an image of a man holding hands or two men holding hands has vastly different meaning in two different cultural contexts. So that's just an example, and we'll look at some more of those later on. So my next question to you all is, how do we know what we know? If we're moving on to our next slide. How do you know your culture? How do you know what's socially acceptable? We've alluded to socialization, but what does that actually mean? How do you learn about social class and behaviors that are acceptable by class, race, and gender? Very few things are completely natural, but rather socially constructed. So that term socially constructed is something you will hear a lot in sociology and gender studies. Human beings determine what race is. There's no biological basis for race. It is entirely socially constructed, and that has huge implications. The same goes with gender roles. Nothing about gender is biological. Some things about sex chromosomes and secondary sex characteristics may be biological, but by and large, our understanding of gender and even sex role is tied to socialization more than to biology. So let's see, we focus on these different structures in order to make sense of the world around us. So, for example, as we're growing up and we need to get along in society with other people in order to survive, we have to follow some of those roles and value systems just in order to survive. So, for example, if you were in a classroom and you were to throw, a paper airplane at your teacher, that's socially unacceptable and you will be reprimanded, right? So you learn through schooling that you have to sit in your desk, you have to listen to your teacher, you have to be quiet, you have to talk only when you raise your hand. All of those appropriate classroom behaviors are not things we're born knowing, but we learn throughout the socialization process. So here's a few different agents of socialization you can see on the presentation. Family is a huge one, especially from infancy through early childhood, where a lot of our behaviors are forming and becoming more rigid. We learn those behaviors through family, particularly parents and siblings, and anybody else who plays a parenting role in our lives, so grandparents, aunts, and uncles, in the larger familial structure, which varies greatly by culture. Schooling plays a huge role. So many children start their early education as young as 3 or 4. So we're in a school environment for almost 20 years of our lives, assuming higher education is part of it. That's a lot of time to be socialized. We learn from our friends and peer groups. We learn from mass media. We learn from religion, government, law, and you can probably even think of some more, but those are the biggies that we always tend to think of. So moving on into our next slide about socialization, I'm going to talk about gender now. Gender socialization starts before we're even born. So I have an image here of a sonogram being shown of a baby that has recently been revealed to possess genitalia that is either male or female. Once a couple or a person finds out that they are carrying a male fetus or male child, they immediately begin to make some assumptions about that child. And you can probably think of examples from your own life of this if you've had friends who've had babies or relatives who've had babies. I posted an image of a sonogram with a bow tie with blue. So already when this infant is not even born yet, when this fetus is a mere 16 to 20 weeks old when they do these gender ultrasounds, we are already making assumptions. And in this image, we're showing a baseball. The parents are dressed in blue. The onesie is blue. The booties are blue. So you can see some assumptions being made there. And then if we flip that script over to a female fetus, again, 16 to 20 weeks in gestation, not even born yet, we're making some assumptions. You see pink, you see flowers, you see a little bow for the hair. The words that they're used are different. On the onesie, it says sweet baby girl. We tend to describe baby girls as being sweet more than we do with boys. Boys tend to get more active adjectives prescribed to them. So again, before you're even born, there are assumptions made about your gender, which we don't even know yet at birth. So big assumptions being made. And it's difficult to raise a child without gender, even in those early phases. You can Google if you're interested in families who've tried to raise their babies without gender and see how difficult that is. And when I'm talking about gender, bear in mind, I'm not talking about genitalia. That's what we talk about when we talk about sex. But a lot of times you'll see gender reveal parties or gender reveal announcements on social media. These are making the assumption that we know something about fetus's gender rather than their sex. So we're making an assumption that because a fetus has a penis, that in the future that fetus is going to like baseball. And that is a form of socialization that happens. When we start so early, it's difficult to make the argument that gender is natural because these children are being socialized before they're even born. So something I'd like you to think more about. Let's look at this next ad for toys. So now we're moving into childhood. The child has been born. They've been assigned a sex at birth. You can see in this image that the toys for boys are very much geared towards creating or fixing things. This one has construction tools. And you can see for the girl one, it's based on household chores, and everything is very pink. One thing we can see if you look at lots of ads for children's toys is that a lot of activities that are socially acceptable for boys are very physical and very active and very creative. Things like Tinker Toys, where we're asking boys to engage in activities that would link to careers in engineering or design. Um, these are challenging their brains in ways that are very different than the ways that we socialize girls. So, girl toys tend to be more performative, where they're performing acts like housekeeping or dressing up as a princess to be looked at. Very rarely are boys socialized to perform in a way that is to be viewed by others, right? They might dress as a superhero, but that's to engage in superhero activities and to run around and play. Where girls are more often dressed as princesses and tutus and are less often engaged in that type of play. Now, one thing I will say is that throughout recent history, the ability of girls to transgress gender roles has been much more potent than the ability of boys. So you will see girls engage in so-called boy activities. Girls can wear pants, girls can play with boy toys, girls are allowed to play sports more so, they're allowed to be tomboys. That exists for girls. The opposite of that has not really been true, where boys are allowed to engage in girl activities and dress in girl clothes and be princesses and things like that. The social sanctions for boys are much greater than they are for girls. Looking at a couple more ads, you can see the boy toy is called a doctor toy, the girl toy is called a nurse toy. Everything is very coded in boy and girl. If we weren't in the middle of a pandemic, I would ask you to go out to a toy store and take a look at, even here in Duluth or Superior, looking at Walmart or Target to see how they organize the toys, and you'll see that this very much holds true even to this day. This is an area we haven't made much progress. There's an ad here I'd encourage you to watch for Princess Castle that actually very much ends up being a little house that girls can play kitchen and do laundry, and so that's the kind of toys that are marketed towards girls. Okay, moving on to the impact of all of that. So we can see by looking at ads for toys that boys and girls they play differently, or they're being asked to play differently. What impact do you think that that actually has? We've talked about some of the roles of women globally versus roles of men globally, and we can see that perhaps these early models of socialization are playing a role in outcomes later on in life. So if we look at the highest paying jobs, construction, finance, insurance, electricity and gas, medicine, things like that, you can see that most of those are dominated by men. And those are fields that men and young boys become interested in earlier because they're socialized to find those things interesting and rewarding, and to begin challenging themselves to do those activities early. So if we look at all of these ads and types of toys that children play with, what does it tell us about the expectations for girls and boys? And how difficult is it to transgress those expectations? And what are the sanctions for doing so? Sanctions, again, can be something as small as a weird look for a boy wearing a princess dress, or as severe as the boy being kicked out of school, being bullied, being beaten by parents for transgressing gender roles. So sanctions can mean just about any kind of behavior that is intended to modify the behavior of the person who is transgressing the expectation. And this does play an impact on us later in life, though these things are very difficult to make any concrete assessment. We don't know that women choose careers in the caring professions just because of the toys they play with as children, but it's reasonable to say that there's some connection. Men out-earn women in nearly every industry, even when controlled for factors like family. Motherhood lowers women's wages on average, whereas it tends to raise men's wages. So once a woman has a child, she can expect to make less money, whereas a man, once he has a family, can expect to make more money. And again, that is controlled for individual choice. So we're looking apples to apples here, not apples to oranges. We're not looking at men who choose to become doctors and women who choose to become nurses. We're looking at men and women who have similar education, similar experience, and work in similar fields. So male physicians and female physicians side by side with similar education and training. We're seeing, when compared apples to apples, that men out earn women in almost every field. Even in the caring professions. So even when men decide to become nurses or teachers or social workers or some of those caring professions, men out earn women in those fields. So the next slide will talk about what happens when we consider race. When we add race to the wage gap, we can see even more stark changes. So overall, men out earn women in every field. But white men and women are a little bit closer in terms of their earnings. Black men and women are very close in terms of their earnings. You see a bigger gap for Asian men and women, but Latina men and women tend to earn more close to each other as well. So what all of this means is that race is a compounding factor. When we've been talking about feminism, and one of the arguments is that men want to be, or women want to be equal to men, we have to continue asking ourselves, to which men do we want to be equal? Because as you can see here, black men are under-earning white men even more than white women are under-earning white men. So again, I ask that question, which men do we want to be equal to? And then how does that play out for black women who have by and large felt ignored by feminism because the wage gap with black men is not as great. So they're not seeing their enemy being, enemy, I say in quotes, being other black people. They're seeing the complication of race being a bigger factor, especially in the wage gap. So take a look at those statistics. I think that's very interesting, and none of these things are quite as simple and clear-cut as we think. Okay. The family, perhaps one of our greatest agents of socialization, as I've talked about. This is our first our group that we're socialized by. From birth, our family teaches us skills, values, and beliefs. They teach us their religion, their class, and all of these expectations that we'll learn through other institutions. You know, when we talked about Marxism and we talked about the ways in which these socializing agents all work together to create sort of a total institution where we're seeing our religion reinforces the beliefs our family taught us, and our family reinforces the beliefs that the media teaches us, which reinforces the beliefs that the schools teach us, and all of these work together to reinforce an image of acceptable behavior. If these things are in conflict, then we have a more difficult time understanding what's correct and what's not correct. So for instance, if the school is teaching you one thing, but your family is teaching you something completely different, that creates a very complicated situation for the child to understand who's right and who's wrong. And they may even modify their behavior depending on the setting that they're in. But in order for the state to maintain control, as Marx would say, we need these factors to all be verifying and reifying one another. So, you know, the mass media is going to support what government officials say and vice versa. So we're learning how to behave in accordance with something that makes sense to us, right? That we're not seeing vastly divergent views on either side. So loving families and high quality environments are more likely to create happy, well-adjusted children. And this is regardless of race, class, gender, ethnicity, or any of those things. One of the best ways to raise healthy, functional adults is to have a loving home, regardless of class or race or other factors that might come into play here. So family tends to be something that we culturally value across the globe very highly because of its role in socializing children and creating healthy, functional adults, healthy, functional, tax-paying adults. So family socializes us in ways that are both conscious and unconscious. We learn to consciously focus on education, discipline, religion, but we may also unconsciously reproduce social inequalities. So, for example, if your family had very rigid gender roles where perhaps father worked outside the home, mother worked in the home, mother stayed home with the children, things like that, you may unconsciously learn that those are acceptable behaviors for gender roles. Another example could be poor families are more likely to teach blind obedience to their children, whereas wealthy families are more likely to teach critical thinking. And that's an interesting tidbit because we could ask ourselves, why would a lower class family be more likely to teach blind obedience? And the answer is because their children are more likely to need that skill to survive. If you're very poor and you are working, or if you're working class and you work in a highly controlled environment, or you're in the military, you work in a factory, or some type of setting where divergence from norms would get you in a lot of trouble or potentially get you fired, that could be a big liability. So parents who are working class, blue-collar parents, are going to teach their children to be obedient, to follow the rules so that they can survive. Whereas wealthy families face fewer restrictions like that. Wealthier families, upper middle class families, find that their children have more opportunities to go to college, they have more opportunities to have jobs where critical thinking will be valued. So they will teach their children to question authority perhaps a little bit more than working class parents would, because their survival depends on it once again. Wealthy families also have more access to leisure and enrichment activities, which can build cultural capital for their children in the future. So a child who takes French lessons just for fun, that child has some capital that they can use later on for employment purposes, or to meet other cultured people and to be in a circle of a sphere of influence of people that have more wealth and power. So again, these are things that unconsciously happen. I think there's very few parents that think that they're raising their children to be cogs in the machine, but in some unconscious ways, they very well might be doing that. Children learn through association with their family about how to view themselves and others. So in association with your family, you start to see who is one of us and who is an other. So who's on the in group and who's on the out group. Again, this can be an important instinct for survival because sticking with our in group helps to provide us with the supports that we need to survive. And letting in outsiders can be a potential danger to our survival. But again, that can also reproduce inequalities where we're learning to associate only with people who look and act like us. Again, going back to that implicit association test, if you're looking at someone who looks different than you, that can be, you may have a bias that was unconsciously taught through family socialization. And again, family also teach us very much about race, gender, class, whether conscious or unconscious. Schools are another socialization agent. School and daycare expands children's worlds to include people different from them. So it's one of the first opportunities children have to see difference, especially if their family is fairly homogenous. Schools may reinforce norms and values that start in the family, or they might clash. So maybe you can think of an example in your life where you had that first clash. I know that my family is very Catholic, and I grew up in a very small community where almost everyone was white. I think everyone was white, recent immigrants from Belgium. And that's all that I was exposed to through most of my primary education. And it wasn't until I went to high school, where I was mainstreamed into a public school, that I had access to people with different religious views and who had different cultural views. That clashed for me, and that clash was very powerful because it was the first time that I started to wonder about what is and is not normal. Is it normal to have some difference? And what is our tolerance of that difference? So think about that for yourself too. What are some things that you would expect to be normal or abnormal based on your own socialization? And again, did that clash happen for you at school? Did it happen somewhere else out in the world? Schools are often also segregated by class. There are a lot of really good peer-reviewed articles out there about the way that we fund public education. Most of the funding for public education comes from the taxes in the community that the school exists. So this has automatically meant that children who are poor tend to go to school with other children who are poor in schools that are also poor. where wealthy children tend to go to schools with other wealthy children with heavily resourced schools because those schools are drawing from a larger tax base. The way that we've funded public education has been extremely problematic for that reason. It's reinforced beliefs about who is deserving of education, and it's also exposed children to limited diversity because they're going to stay in the community where the tax base is. So you might know this just from your own schooling. Did you have a choice in which school you went to? Perhaps you had a choice in public versus private, but were you able to go to a school that was in a different community than yours? In a lot of cases, students are not able to do that and are instead sent to the community school with whatever resources that community school has. And that could vary greatly. And I'll post an article potentially on our message board about that if I can find it. Formal learning and informal learning happen in school. Sometimes we call this the actual curriculum and then the hidden curriculum. So the hidden curriculum is all the stuff that happens that's not the intentional learning that your teacher is providing. Things like sports, where you can learn teamwork, the arts, where you can learn creativity. Schools teach students about bureaucracy and rules. So I gave an example early about learning how you shouldn't throw things at your teacher. You're learning how to behave in social and public environments through the school. That's not necessarily part of the curriculum, but it's something that we all learn. And schools also reinforce gender norms heavily. Perhaps you can think about things like how did dress code differ for boys and girls in your school? And perhaps you can think about did how did the teachers in your school have students like line up? I know we would sometimes have the girls line up in one line, the boys line up in another. You could probably think of things like gendered locker rooms or gendered bathrooms. So schools have lots of ways of gendering us, and it's certainly not all as obvious as dress code. The next group is a peer group. This is a hugely influential factor. The people who were born around the same time that you were, the people you're going to go to school with, the people you're going to be friends with, they will have similar interests, social position, and age in common. That's your peer group. For example, I think most of you are Generation Z in this class, although there's some diversity there. I'm an older millennial. I was born kind of right at the beginning of the millennial era. Perhaps some of you in class are Gen X or baby boomers, or perhaps even the greatest generation. Those are the ones that preceded Gen Z. I have a little guy who's 1.5, and he'll be the alpha generation. So we have multiple generations coexisting right now. And our peer group is typically our generational group. Peers will reinforce acceptable behavior using sanctions, just like family will. So I think the movie Mean Girls is a pretty good example of this, where the girls in the school learn the social hierarchy through serious sanctions. A simple example could be you don't have anyone to sit with in the cafeteria. That's a sanction for not meeting the social norms of the school. Individuals tend to view their own peer group more positively than others. A good example of this right now would be the OK Boomer hashtag. There's a lot of frustration directed at baby boomers right now, some maybe just unjustly. That is coming largely from millennials and Gen Z. Millennials tend to stick together and appreciate their own social group better than other social groups, and that's a very, very normal thing that we see throughout our peer groups generationally. We also tend to assume that the behavior of our own peer group is normal. So I would ask you to think about your own peer group and some of the norms that you've learned. So I'm going to make that our discussion board post this week. Post on the discussion board which generation peer group you grew up in, and what are some of the values and norms that your peer group holds. So again, for many of you that'll be pretty similar, but for others it may not be super similar. So think about that. And also in your post, write about how gender norms are expected to play out by your generational peer group. So what are some things that Gen Z is seeing for expected gender roles versus baby boomers? And then, if you want to add any commentary in there about this hashtag dialogue that we're having these days about baby boomers. I know Ella in my previous sociology class had some interesting commentary about the OK Boomer um, hashtag, so feel free to add that commentary. One thing I've really also noticed is that there's a pretty big misunderstanding amongst the generational groups about who is and is not a millennial. At this point, millennials are largely in their late 20s to mid 30s, um, maybe even pushing 40 in some cases. So, millennials are not the fresh out of high school, early college group anymore. And I'm assuming you all know that because that wouldn't be your generation. But in your response, where you're writing about um, your peer group and some of the expectations, I'd also like you to write about any misunderstandings about your generation. What do you think that media or social media are getting wrong about your generation? I'm looking forward to reading these posts. People in the same cohort generally have similar social and cultural values and have been influenced by similar socio-political and socioeconomic environments. So I have an example here about the baby boom, but I'm actually going to talk briefly about this pandemic that we're in right now. Um, for young people coming of age right now, people who aren't able to have a high school graduation or a prom, um, people who have been homebound and will be homebound for the foreseeable future, this is going to have a huge impact on future generations. And I imagine it's going to bond Generation Z and the Alpha generation in a very interesting way. So, for example, the millennial generation would frequently talk about where were you on 9/11? What impact did that have on you? That was a huge conversation. On 9/11, I was in high school and I was very scared. And they had the videos playing in my rural high school of the planes hitting the towers. That had a huge impact on my own generational group and on our notions of security and safety. The way that we view national security has changed tremendously since then. I remember a time when airports did not have security at all, like they do now. Anyone could walk in. All you needed was a ticket to get on the plane. I remember a time when, I could stand at the window in the airport and wave at my mom as her plane took off. We don't do that anymore, right? And that all changed after 9/11. Some of the things we've allowed the government to do since then around surveillance have changed tremendously since 9/11. So that's one um, socioeconomic kind of change that happened during the millennial generation that's bonded us together. So for the baby boomer generation, they watched a president die on national television when John F. Kennedy was shot. They watched the first war being publicized on news media. Prior to that, people talked about war, but they never saw war. The popularity of war dropped tremendously after news media were able to publish images of war. So, baby boomers were really defined by the Vietnam War, the draft, the murder of John F. Kennedy. These are some things that bonded their generation tremendously. Baby boomers came of age during a time of a lot of economic growth and optimism. After the war was over, after World War II was over, and the baby boom happened, there was tremendous economic growth fueled by the birth and the growth of a middle class, a huge growth of middle class, because of social policy, government policy, because of banking regulations, because of the ability to form unions. All of that created a very strong and well-paid middle class. And baby boomers grew up during that time of growth and optimism. Their lives were expected to be longer and more prosperous than their parents' lives. Um, they were expected to, they expected public policy to help them, to benefit them, right? That the ability to get a mortgage for a middle class family was assumed. The ability to survive on one income was assumed. The ability to get a high wage job with limited skills and education was assumed. The ability to form a union to bargain was assumed. And the baby boom at this point is the largest generation of all of history. And unless we see a big boom in babies as a result of this pandemic, I don't know that we'll see another boom quite like that ever again. Maybe never again. Who knows? Millennials, by contrast to the baby boomers, have much less optimism. We are not expected to live as long, even as our parents. We are seeing the shrinking of the middle class. Much fewer assumptions can be made about our ability to have more money than our parents. We need a lot of education in order to secure the same kind of lifestyle our parents had with no education. We're paying a lot more for education. We are in debt much more deeply than previous generations because of the costs associated with education, as well as the costs of everything that have gone up. Inflation has happened at a higher rate than our wages have gone up. Wages have stagnated largely since the 90s. The minimum wage hasn't gone up in decades. So our generation is expected to do worse financially than our parents and is expected to die younger than our parents. So we don't have as much optimism for those reasons. Our future is much less certain. And Gen Z, I leave a question mark. You all are Gen Z. What do we think is going to happen with Generation Z? Will they be more optimistic? Will they be less? What will be the biggest defining characteristic of this generation? Is it going to be this global pandemic? Globalization has certainly played a role. So again, exploring that in the comments will be very interesting. All right, enough on peer group. I'm going to talk a little bit about mass media now. Historically, family and our local communities have had the greatest control over our socialization. And today I'd say mass media holds more of that power. Children spend time watching and consuming media almost from the day they're born. I know when I gave birth in the hospital room I was in, there was a TV. I did not have it on, but I know that other people would and could, and there's no judgment there. You may have the TV on. So the first sounds your newborn hears could even be a television ad. Who knows? But that has changed also tremendously over the course of several generations. Mass media introduces us to ideas and images that reflect the larger society. So this is where we can learn if what our parents have taught us and what our schools are teaching us are in alignment with what the larger culture thinks is normal and acceptable. By and large, those things are considered to be normal and acceptable. And we'll see a lot of reinforcement happening between school, peer group, parents, and media representation in government. But occasionally they don't match up, and that creates a complicated situation for children. So for example, a lot of media treats sex and sexuality very differently than religion and peer group might treat sex and sexuality and appropriate sexual behavior. And that's something that if it's in conflict, might be very difficult to reconcile in our brains. So we might come to understand that there are certain social and sexual behaviors that are in conflict, right? The media is telling us it's okay to have sex at a younger age or to have non-monogamous premarital sex, where our family and our religion might be telling us that those things are not okay. So then individuals are kind of left in that limbo in the middle to decide what is acceptable and okay. And sometimes peer group plays a large role in that as well. And, that is a matter of opinion across the board. In the US, 90% of households have personal computers, 96% have televisions, 80% of adults watch TV regularly, meaning 4 or more hours per day on average. We watch a lot of TV. And that doesn't necessarily mean TV on a TV set. It can also mean Netflix on your computer, or any way through which you might watch mass-produced media. Some more data points here. White children tend to watch less TV than black children in the United States. There's any number of reasons for why that could be. I'll leave that to you to determine. You can Google it if you'd like. Children spend as much time watching TV as they do in school or interacting with family. So we cannot downplay the huge impact that mass media and television play on our socialization, what we learn to be acceptable behaviors. Children who watch more TV have slower cognitive development, more passivity, less creativity, and are at a higher risk of obesity. So TV is not necessarily a great socializing agent, but it is a reality of our lives. So we have to kind of learn how to balance those things. Okay, there's a wide range of information and opinion available, much more so than ever before. And most people don't have experience with much diversity in their media consumption. People tend to seek out media that reinforces their already held beliefs. So a good example of this would be if you hold conservative viewpoints, you might tend to watch Fox News as your news source more than someone who holds more liberal viewpoints, because Fox News is going to validate the view that you have. And vice versa. Someone with a more liberal viewpoint is probably less likely to watch Fox News and maybe more likely to read Huffington Post, for example, or NPR. So we tend to look for confirmation of our own bias. So if we believe in a certain worldview, we're not going to naturally expose ourselves to a lot of diversity from that worldview. That's just a human nature tendency, I think. If we're going to argue nature versus nurture, I think that we tend to naturally stick with viewpoints that make sense to us already rather than seeking out ones that are challenging our worldview. And that creates a lot of problems because if you're unlikely to seek out information that challenges you, you're unlikely to expand your worldview. So, if you're only looking for information that already holds your beliefs, you're going to have a hard time, especially in sociology, where you're often being asked to create a sociological perspective that challenges the view you were raised to have. So, for example, if you were raised to believe that gender roles should be strictly held and that men should work, women should stay home, something like that, and then you are reinforcing that by reading only materials that say that that's the best possible way to have a household, that's the most normal way to have a household, and then you're exposed out in the world to people who don't hold that viewpoint, it's going to challenge you to either change your viewpoint or to hold your viewpoint potentially more strongly. So I would challenge all of you to expand your horizons and check out sources that are reliable and also that challenge your worldview. I think that's an important thing to do as college students and as global citizens. So I'm going to stop here for now because we're at almost an hour and I think this is a lot to digest. I am going to talk more about different age groups and socialization throughout our age and gender, and I'll make a second video for that. But for this week, right now, I would ask that you answer the response question that I posed in this video. So little sneak peek, you have to watch the video to find out what the assignment is, and work your way through the socialization PowerPoint. Once you're done with that, check out the videos that are in the PowerPoint and post your discussion, and that's your homework for the week, and I will grade you on that for your attendance points. I'm also partially wrapping up because my husband is coming in the back door of the house, so so I'm going to wrap us up for now. I will post another video for you all next week, and I think we'll do something similar where the discussion board question will be in the video and you have to watch it to find out. And for now, this will be your attendance and participation grade, so 20 points for posting an answer to that question for the week. And I'm not going to do this twice a week. It'll just be a once a week video for you to watch. All right, take care out there. Wash your hands. Stay home. Take care of yourselves. Do the best that you can. And reach out to me, please, if you're struggling with any of this content. If you have any questions on anything I talked about, questions about anything in the PowerPoint, or questions about anything that's been graded so far. All right. It's been a great time chatting with you, and I will see you next week.